welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore. On the show today, we have Brian Pace. Brian is a very interesting guy, and I think you're all going to like this episode. Brian is studying evolutionary ecology, evolutionary biology. He's helped with a ton of different projects. He's contributing over at The Third Wave as a kind of science consultant or director. Again, we get into that in the show. Sorry, Brian. And also has founded a couple other projects. Mind Manifest Midwest. Clever name. It took me a while to understand what's going on there. And yeah, it's essentially a psychedelic club or organization. Check it out. They got a great Facebook page, a lot of good information. And it's Brian's Psychedelic Club. So check that out. And also, he's got a great project going on called Finding the Others Project. So a great project to try to network different clubs and to help people get engaged with other clubs, and to also, come out about their psychedelic use, because it's one of the biggest activist moves you can do is come out, and secondarily is find the others. So hope you really dig it, and I think his projects are going to be really impactful and meaningful. Brian has been working pretty hard in this field for a while, and it's like a part-time venture like it is for most of us, since he's still a graduate student working on his PhD. So I would expect a lot more incredible stuff to come from Brian. So keep an eye on that guy. He's one to watch. Really, really awesome dude. So hope you enjoy it. So if you want to support the show, there's the normal means. Leave us a review on Facebook. It does make a difference. Same thing with iTunes. It does make a big difference. And telling your friends also helps quite a bit. If you think people are on the fence about a psychedelic podcast, let them know about us. Let them know what you think. We think you'll be doing us quite the favor by just letting your friends know. Also, by the time this episode comes out, there will only be about 1 day left before we close sales on the live version of the Navigating Psychedelics course. This is a course that is live supported by Kyle and I. It is the full Navigating Psychedelics course plus 4 live supported classes with with Kyle and I available for question and answer. Also some instruction. So if you have questions, you can bring them to the class and we can discuss them in real time. These classes are about an hour and a half long. Also, we will have access to private groups where we can discuss this. There's going to be one on Facebook where we can have more secret conversations than normal. And also, we'll use a tool like Slack or Discord for a non-Facebook option. Discord has great privacy and security. Same thing with Slack. So either of those should be pretty good for your needs. And yeah, building community, I think, is one of the biggest things you'll get from this. A lot of you out there are a little isolated, living in interesting pockets of the world or country, and don't really have a psychedelic community yet. And this is a great way to jumpstart that, because you get to check in with folks in real time for classes. You could self-organize little study groups if you chose. And yeah, check it out. I think you'll dig it. If you want to learn more, you can see the full listing over at Psychedelics Today shop.com. And you can find the link from psychedelicstoday.com. You can also enroll for the class from our Teachable site, psychedelicstoday.teachable.com. So yeah, just learn more, see what we're doing. It might really be suitable for you. We've had psychiatrists be really into it. We've had therapists, nurses, and normal civilians all appreciate the class. I would really like to get more criticism of the class, but nobody's really given us much criticism. And this is something I really wish I had. If I had this when I was in my undergrad, it would have saved me a lot of time and stress. And yeah, it's not that Kyle and I are super smart. We're kind of smart, but we put together something that we wanted and we wished we had in the past. And it was, a really great and difficult project, but we put it out for you. So I hope you enjoy this episode of the show. I hope you at least check out what we're offering over there for the live version of Navigating Psychedelics, and hope you check in for additional podcasts. Thank you all for listening, and enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore. Today on the show we have Brian Pace. Brian, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Nice to see you again.
Absolutely. Yeah, same here. So we had recorded before, but had some failures. So this is do-over number one. So I'm hoping we nail this one. So let's chat a little bit about who you are. Like you grew up in an interesting part of the country, Portland, Oregon, but now we're in Columbus, right?
Correct. Yeah. So let's see here. I mean, I like to say I moved to Columbus, Ohio by way of Ecuador. So after I finished a bit of time out doing my undergraduate in Portland, Oregon, I went down to the Ecuadorian Amazon and worked on a project that was inspired by some of the work that Paul Stamets had done with mycoremediation on Chevron Texaco petroleum contamination out there for a year. And then after that, I came back to Portland for a little while and then decided to start going to grad school. And came out to the Ohio State University and started working with Dr. Kristen Mercer, who's a plant evolutionary ecologist. And we were able to talk a lot about many things that interest me. So I think one of the last named positions I had at the Ohio State University was U.S. Borlaug Global Food Security Fellow. I think a lot about agrobiodiversity and climate change. So climate change is a pretty big force. Right now, as we record, I believe that much of North Carolina is underwater from one of the more intense hurricane landfalls that region has had. So climate change is going to continue to get worse. And as evolutionary biologists, we recognize that diversity is the fundamental toolbox with which nature uses to respond to stresses and selective pressures. So a lot of my travel has put me in contact with marginal communities. It turns out that agrobiodiversity is often conserved and associated with indigenous peoples who often conserve these varieties. So think, blue corn and red corn and short corn and popcorn for cultural purposes, for ritual purposes. And so in Mexico, I spent some time around the Maya and various Maya communities. And my work in the Ecuadorian Amazon put me in the region where a number of Quechua, Waorani, other indigenous groups are present. So I think for many years I've been aware of the indigenous connection to the land and plant medicine, and it's definitely influenced my thoughts as somebody who has personally taken psychedelics 22 years now, and so they've influenced my interest in learning in a deep way, something about biology, nature, and evolution ecology. Ecology means home studies. So ecology is studying everything in one's vicinity, and evolution is the study of the change of populations over time in response to various selective pressures. So
that's great. I think we need a lot more of that attitude in the psychedelic world. So glad you're here and doing it. And you hold a position over at Third Wave. Can you kind of talk about what that is?
Yeah, so for the last 2 years, I met Paul Austin down at the Ibogaine conference, the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance conference in Tepoztlan, Mexico, while I was finishing out a year of fellowship down in southern Mexico. I had heard Dennis McKenna was going to be speaking about plant intelligence, and it was just a long bus ride away. So it seemed like a great opportunity. And I went out and I really found a lot of people that I could relate with. I think, out here in Ohio, I'm in a pretty conservative, state, first of all, but agriculture, the department that I'm in, the Department of Horticulture and Crop Sciences, it's not exactly Woodstock out here. So going to the Ibogaine Therapy Alliance conference was fundamental in my decision to start becoming more outspoken about psychedelics and what information I've gathered in my career about these plant secondary compounds that seem to influence human consciousness in really interesting ways. So I'm sure your listeners are aware, but Ibogaine has been used to heal people of pretty dire addictions. It's a substance and a treatment of last resort. And so seeing this really vast group, diversity of people at the Ibogaine conference, you have doctors risking their licensure, you have nurses, and you have West African shamanic practitioners, and recovering and perhaps even former heroin addicts. And it was such an eclectic mix of people, a passionate mix of people, that I think I started questioning myself, saying, well, if these people are risking so much, if they're going to whatever country they can to do this work, I can probably speak up. I can probably talk to my community about these powerful and useful substances.
It's a quick interjection for listeners out there about Ibogaine. Very helpful, but there are risks. It's probably the most risky of the psychedelics, I would say, maybe. I don't know. The commonly known psychedelics. I'm sure there's some other dangerous ones.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And many of those, topics were addressed quite directly at that conference. I was really impressed with the way that the moderators, the participants, did not shy away from difficult topics, whether they were about the use of the medicine or the fact that some people have died through improper administration, through... Basically, if you're trying to kick heroin and you do Ibogaine and you decide halfway through that you would like to do some heroin, you're going to die of a heroin overdose in the middle of a hallucinatory experience.
Which sounds interesting, but a little too final, But yeah, there's, cardiac, there's all sorts of shit. And it's, people are working to mitigate that. Yeah, actively.
And it's one of those things where more research needs to happen. But, I think I got a little bit off track here trying to give a little backstory. At that conference, I spent a lot of time with Paul Austin, who had just started the third wave and had been, producing like infographics to make the whole microdosing thing, which was fairly new at the time, a bit more accessible to the general public. And we hit it off. We hung out for a little while, and then he came out and visited me in Chiapas, where I was living. He was living down in Oaxaca, and we started, collaborating and talking. And so I've played a role as an advisor or a strategist. Is a term I'm comfortable with talking about with my relationship with the third wave. And we've really watched the third wave grow and become a resource and build a team. So that the general public has a resource on psychedelics that is, shall we say, not covered in sci-fi imagery and fractals and that kind of thing, which it does matter. It matters that people feel comfortable engaging with the material, and I think the third wave has done a really good job of doing that. And Paul's been particularly successful with bringing the conversation about psychedelics to places, at least publicly, where they've been absent. Bringing the microdosing conversation to tech and business conferences, I thought was novel and good. So we continue to work together.
Cool. Yeah, one of the things I've been very impressed with him about is that he's getting into places that many of us would never even really consider to get in front of, like these kind of very interesting business meetings in Berlin and other places where global leaders or entrepreneurs are hanging out. I wouldn't be surprised if he's talking microdosing at Davos in the near future for the IMF or something.
I know he wouldn't turn it down. So, I mean, the thing is that the third wave has been able to do something that I think is important and something we forget about, strangely, even though we orbit around it a lot, which is building bridges and speaking other people's languages in a way that is accessible to broad groups of people. And I mean, I think that, as we start talking about, for instance, some of the intersectional issues that are facing the psychedelic community today, the psychedelic community is fairly white, fairly privileged, overwhelmingly male. There's reasons for this, and there's also reasons for who gets to speak where. I think that the reality that the drug war is a racialized project filters quite significantly for who feels comfortable speaking about taking illegal drugs that can have your life taken away from you for a very, very long time. And so by addressing and acknowledging the reality that there are many, many, many black and brown people in my state, in Ohio, for instance, more than half of the arrests are for cannabis, which seems absurd.
For the whole state or for the whole area?
The whole state. And then if you then do a quick thought experiment and ask yourself, well, who is more likely to be arrested for cannabis? I taught a class here at Ohio State, actually 3 floors down from where I am right now, on cannabis. And I assure you, everyone in that room had experience using cannabis. And none of us had any fear getting in our cars or walking out of that building and having somebody stop and frisk us or execute a warrantless search of our vehicle.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Like drug justice. Obviously, drug war is more of a war on people, a deliberate war on people that we've got to figure out. And we're working on it. I think the consciousness on this is fixing itself kind of through substantial effort. But something we need to stay on top of. So let's jump over to Find the Others, this interesting project you're working on and is, I think, soon to launch.
Yeah. So Find the Others is a project that we pitched way back at Psychedelic Science 2017, and we had been talking with people like Natalie Gins and Ismail Ali from MAPS, and then other folks who are involved in the Psychedelic Society organizing group. So we brought that to Psychedelic Science, to I believe it was the second convening of Psychedelic Society organizers, and we said, hey, let's do a video project that talks about what psychedelic societies are. Essentially, a debut of online video debut for psychedelic societies as a phenomenon. So this was something that Paul and I pitched at first, and then it took a while. Projects they go down little bunny trails and sometimes floating eddies for a little while. But in its heart, we wanted to solicit video introductions of people's individual psychedelic society communities, and describe their organization, what it does, and why. So, the reason why I think now is the time to do this is that Daniel Jabbour founded the San Francisco Society, a Psychedelic Society, in 2012. And since then, we're at probably 100 psychedelic societies of some sort globally. So that's a huge growth in such a short period of time, and the project's pretty straightforward. It's got 2 objectives. One, if you weren't aware that there's a psychedelic society in your city, for instance, I'm out here in Columbus, Ohio. Our society is called Mind Manifest Midwest. Now you are. And 2, if you are in a place, and I always, pick some random city, if you're in Bozeman, Montana or something, and you look around and you're pretty sure that there's no publicly organized venue to discuss psychedelics in your community, and you see all of these faces and people talking about theirs, and you feel like there's something missing from your community, well, then maybe you're the person who's going to start that community. And so on the Find the Others Project website, so findtheothersproject.org, findtheothersproject.com will both get you there. We have a number of resources that have been produced by the Psychedelic Society community. I believe we've got links to Psychedelics Today there that are providing resources. Other groups like the Aware Project, started by Ashley Booth. These groups have made it so that you don't have to go, oh, gee, what are we going to do? Because we've iterated this so much in so many different contexts. There's not only resources for how to structure a group in a way that's not going to cause legal issues for you or anything like that, but you can also reach out, as I did when I was starting my group, to other organizers who are generally more than happy to answer any questions, provide mutual aid, even show up and be a speaker themselves if you're looking for somebody to get you kicked off. And I think the idea here is that these are community groups that are designed to fill a lacuna in the public discourse around psychoactive substances generally, but I've been somewhat aware for a while, and Michael Pollan's book, I think, is emblematic of this, that psychedelics are not just illegal, they're also taboo. So, for instance, in Michael Pollan's book, he spends a good deal of time exploring the one or two psilocybin mushroom experiences he had way back when in his early 20s, and he's very careful to frame them as sort of youthful indiscretions or messing around and experimenting. But then a few paragraphs down, he has this sort of throwaway line where he's like, but of course, living in the Manhattan set, we would blow all kinds of coke all the time. And it's like, whoa.
That was a funny little statement he had. And it stuck out for me. And I hope it stuck out for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I think that the reality is that, we've had, all throughout the 80s, you can pick any, I'm thinking of Bright Lights, Big City by Michael J. Fox. Wow, thanks, brain. There's a number of movies where cocaine was lionized as a luxury drug for the well-to-do. And culturally, that carries weight in ways where I think most people and much of the issues that we're facing today in psychedelics is that we're having a cultural hangover from what happens in the upheavals in the late 60s and early 70s. It's hard to separate out how much of that was related to the influence of psychedelics, but it would be foolish to say that it did not have some kind of big effect on our cultural understanding of ourselves and the various issues around authority and around the structure of society and where are we going and what are we doing and all of those things that I think left a bad taste in a number of let's say tastemakers' mouths. And as a result, here we are having to create very particular spaces that no institution has put any effort towards curating. I had to spend a lot of time talking to my folks at the Ohio State University about having a literature review club around cannabis. And some of that comes to the reality about federal funding and having certain conversations that could be construed as even neutral on the topic of psychedelics. Puts you in a bin where you're not to be trusted. So anyway.
Yeah, it's a big deal. I don't know exactly how to address it, but I think these clubs and organizations are a great step forward. I think I started organizing about 2009 in Boston, and that really helped a lot. Kind of educating folks on shamanism, the drug war, all sorts of everything, but drugs was always like a core component to what I was talking about, in my mind at least. But it was very helpful to like have that community come up, even though it was a really expensive project. And I commend everybody else doing it too. So when do you guys plan to launch?
So I mean, findtheothersproject.org is online right now. So you can see what we're about and where we're going with the project immediately. The things that we're trying to make sure that are built is a directory so that we're linked up with a group that is our sister site, which would be the psychedelics.community. There's the global psychedelic network there, who Stephen Reed was a part of discussing how the Find the Others project would come on the scene. And so it was important to get some buy-in from people who have been more active in making sure that psychedelic societies are working together. So Quasi Adusi, who I believe has been on Psychedelics Today, has been a real powerhouse of organizing in the psychedelics world. Helen Daring out in Portland, Oregon, runs a psychedelic society that I believe is meeting weekly now. So they throw excellent events, and just contacting people and talking about this project. The project itself, I fully acknowledge, was inspired by Psychedelics Today, hashtag Psychedelics Today or psychedelicstoday.org, which I'm sure you're aware of since you're a partner on that one as well. And Mike Margolis and Brian Norman, all the kids out at Symposia had done a really excellent job with a very simple, keep it simple, online project that said, psychedelics because it helped me with my relationships. Psychedelics because it, made me enjoy sunset really well. Just call that rebranding. And, directly about how the need for a Find the Others project was to not just have a whole bunch of scattered Facebook pages and Twitter handles. And Psychedelics .community does a really great job of already providing a directory. What I wanted to see, though, was a way that people could get all of the information about a group, but also sort of a perennial introductory video that tells people in a much more human and I would say even 21st century way about what it is that you're doing and why. And so we asked people to answer some questions about what they do in their community, and they can have folks who are organizers of their community or participants in their community. And so a number of these groups did a really good job. The Portland Psychedelic Society had members speaking. The Boston Entheogenic Network had members speaking, and then other groups. It's for instance, in my video, it's just me talking about our project, and that's fine too. I think the idea is that with the diversity, and I study diversity in one way or another. With the diversity that's out there, the topics that people are talking about, I know the Australian Society, for instance, was started by a bunch of neuroscientists. So that group's going to have a different feel than my group, which was started with myself, and we've already gone into my background, and then my co-founder, Ryan McGuire, who's a graduate of the Transpersonal Institute, which is now Sophia University. He's a therapist, does psychedelic integration therapy. And so, I think that just showcasing that diversity, having people speak in their own words about why they do it is not only, I would say, the best way to describe the psychedelic society phenomenon, but also the most fair and sort of democratic, given that what's really happening right now is that a lot of effort on the part of local leaders who believe that they can change the culture by holding a certain kind of space. And I believe that too. I think that that we can fight taboos when we can have conversations about that which was taboo in the grocery store, at the bar, with our parents. And I think that's definitely what's needed with regard to psychedelics. It's a bit demystifying as well as destigmatizing.
Yeah, both of those. So is it complicated to get a video up on the site? Like if I wanted to submit one?
No, we'll have a pretty basic interface that is just, I'll send out the document that it was the specs document, and you look over it, and it's really just to make sure that everybody has a clean shot, and that we're sort of on topic of the group, which is pretty broad. But what are you doing? Why are you doing it? What advice would you have for other folks who are in this position? So I mean, from Mexico, I would say the Ibogaine conference, some work with a peyote Maricame up on a Mayan mountain, and the work of Nishay Deveneaux, who recently took a position at Case Western here in Cleveland, by the way. Her work on coming out of the psychedelic closet, identity politics, and psychedelics. Those three things, I think, created a perfect storm for me wanting to put something together. So, I mean, for our first group, we just met at a noisy bar, and we made sure that there was, a lot of folks coming out. And we did kind of a mishmash of things. It being the first meeting, I spent some time outlining what we hope to accomplish with a psychedelic society. And then I believe I adapted a presentation I did for the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science on plant secondary compounds and human health. In this case, I was talking about indole alkaloids, so everything from ibogaine to DMT to LSD and psilocybin. And so we did that, and then we sort of wrapped up with a storytelling event. And I think since then we have, we've broken those sorts of things out into their own little bites. So I mean, for instance, when Lex Pegler and Mike Margolis came out on their Blue Dot tour, they stopped in Columbus, and we had a really great storytelling event. If you go to psychedelicsalon.com, I think there's Psychedelic Columbus, where you can hear the stories that we told at that event. We've done a lot of different things. I just did a microdosing event. It was my first invited speaker position for on behalf of my Manifest Midwest at a place called the Idea Foundry, which is one of these places where you can learn how to blacksmith and 3D print all at once. And but there was a DIY biohackers group, so they were citizen science, and so we did a talk on that. But we've had other speakers. Being out here in Ohio, I feel like I have some advice for people who feel isolated. They're like, well, I'm not in Washington, D.C., or I'm not on the West Coast. I'm not on anybody's speakers circuit. And we've been really successful by just emailing people in the space and being like, hey, do you have an hour to talk to our group, to maybe give a presentation? Or Bob Jesse, for instance, preferred a conversation. And a lot of these kinds of these groups, these talks with luminaries in the psychedelic space have been facilitated by technologies like Zoom. Bradley Foster out of the Toronto Psychedelic Society has put together a couple of them, and we've collaborated together where multiple cities are tuning into one talk all at once. And I think it's really fabulous that can happen. And I think that the people in the psychedelic community are generally pretty open and quite generous with their time, to reach out to people who are locally trying to figure all this stuff out together. So, I mean, being out here in Columbus is not exactly hindered the ability to have community around this. And I also want to say, when talking about psychedelic societies and the need for them, according to federal statistics, you've got these are like DEA or probably DEA statistics. I'd have to check. 20% of Americans over the age of 15, 16 at the time that they took this, which I think was a couple of years ago, have had some lifetime experience with psychedelics. And when we're talking about like LSD in particular, that's 11%. So that's huge. I read recently also that, that millennials are taking psychedelics at the same, if not higher rate than boomers were. So I think all of that changes the landscape, and we can start taking certain things for granted. Like, for instance, if you talk to 25 people in a night, one or two of them, depending on where you're at, we'll know what we're talking about.
I think I remember Mitch Gomez from Dance Safe, I think he's the executive director, saying recently that greater than 50% of the population in the U.S. has done illegal compounds starting at age like 15 and up. So like if you look at the full spectrum, it's an incredible number.
Yeah, if we're just talking illegal substances, I totally believe that.
But yeah, it's nice that psychedelics take up a big chunk of that number. And are growing. I think we're not going away, and we're only going up. And clubs are a great way to, fight what we hear on TV. So yesterday I was staying at a friend's house, and he put on some ESPN show in the morning talking about this one guy who just got traded to the Patriots. Great player apparently, but apparently has a ferocious addiction to marijuana, to pot, and the way they were talking about it was unbelievable. I immediately had to write to one of the anchors on Twitter and go, "You are such an idiot. Do you not understand what you're saying?" Like, I think the main problem is that this guy not being able to stop smoking pot might get in the way of him making very many millions of dollars. But, that's more on him. I think that's more of a lifestyle choice. He doesn't really care. But it's just, this dialogue, this way of talking about drugs on the popular media is unreal. And these club organizations can insulate us a bit. Go ahead.
Was that a football star who was prevented from being traded or whatever?
No, it was just a really inexpensive trade as a result of his smoking.
So, I mean, I recently saw some, I think they were on Democracy Now! Because I listened to that a lot. There was some football players on there talking about cannabis in particular, because traumatic brain injury is something that is a big problem. And, they give them opiates, they give them all kinds of anti-seizure medications, but cannabis is a wonderful medicine for it. And these people, even in states where it's legal, the NFL is the one who gets to decide. So, I mean, I think that if we can talk about, cannabis or PTSD for veterans to the general public, things become a lot more accessible. And I mean, one of the things that we emphasize on the Find the Others Project .org site is that, it's not just for people who have experience with psychedelics that psychedelic societies are organized. I think that one of the things that, I found to be lacking in my own life growing up is that, there's these interesting interesting substances that there's these sort of tantalizing stories about. But the point of entry for a lot of people, the being inculcated with certain cultural norms, that's really up to the luck of the draw for a lot of people. And I mean, it's great that there's sites like Arrowhead and Blue Light and DMT Nexus that are providing and aggregating, and Third Wave, of course, this information that is reliable and such. But it is not the same as meeting somebody who can talk to you after a rough trip and say it's going to be okay. Or, for instance, before you've had any trip, and says, "Hey, have you ever heard about set and setting? How much are you trying to take anyhow? What is it that you're trying to take?" And to create a little bit of, the things that communities do best, mutual aid, support, that kind of thing, I think goes a long way. And I think that if psychedelics are ever going to be reintegrated meaningfully in society, we're going to have some kind of mentorship. I know, Timothy Leary and others way back when were advocating for a licensure project with regard to psychedelics, sort of a license to fly. I know Kenneth Tupper, as an education scholar out in Vancouver, BC, has done a lot of really great work envisioning what would be a good model for getting people situated in a healthy way with regard to psychedelics.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually was just recording with Lex Pelger yesterday at Bluebird Botanicals, and he was talking about the way Leary kind of thought about it, like you're born with the right to fly, which is kind of funny. I think I've heard Leary say it a few different ways. And if you screw up enough, get caught driving on LSD or whatever, then it can be removed from you. Or, certain predispositions, we really... Have you heard of this one? I think in Fadiman's research, there was something about people with red, blue, or red, green color blindness being predisposed to HPPD from LSD. So, like, does that sound real to you? Like, I haven't read the paper.
A good friend of mine who's no longer with us was blue-green colorblind, and I don't believe this is N equals 1, but I don't believe he had that kind of response. But these kinds of things, like Fadiman's work, is so fascinating because he did some low-hanging fruit in a lot of ways. Just survey data is wonderful. Get people to self-report a well-designed survey. You can learn quite a bit. And he's got Sophia Korb is the one who is doing a lot of that data crunching. She's done a great job of, from a statistics perspective, I'm impressed, of presenting what they can know and what they don't have enough information to know and what they would like to know. So I think generally as a researcher by trade, the absolute criminality of the fact that psychedelics have been outlawed for research is, we're not just talking addiction and PTSD. We're also talking about basic understandings of neurobiology. Many people are unaware that it was the history of LSD itself that played a big role in unveiling the serotonin system in humans. And it turns out now, after a conversation I had the other day, never mind. Serotonin is something that goes all the way back to yeast. It goes very, very far back. And we were completely unaware of it until LSD came on the scene and perturbed things in such a way that it became interesting to Western scientists. So we have no idea what we may learn when we start looking at the role of these neurochemical mimics in our biosphere. And so we don't. It's one of those Rumsfeldisms. We don't know what we don't know right now.
No knowns and unknown. I read his biography. Know Thy Enemy. It was fun. But yeah, it was fascinating. So maybe let's jump to some other... You named a lot of folks that helped out with your project. So maybe anybody you may have missed that you want to maybe give a shout out to?
Well, Bob Desi is somebody that I think has a really careful and well thought out view of what's been going on in the psychedelic space. And so he's somebody who has been kind enough to speak to our group and has provided me with some feedback. The societies in general, there's been a lot of lively conversation online. And I want to hasten to say right now that this is a collaborative project that I think came from a sense that, if we can build things together, then we can support each other. And so by creating a project that allows people to speak in their own words about what what it is that they're doing with their psychedelic society. I thought that was probably the most accessible way to present something that really is a phenomenon that is global. And while there are many people who are contributing in big ways, is such a team effort. And so, there's been really excellent organizing efforts from Eva Cesarona out in the EU. The Third Wave team has provided web design services to get this thing off the ground, make it look and clean like they're real good at. My local team here in Columbus has been great. So Anthony Williams has been working on the web development, and my friend Mitch Mitchison has been helping with some of the video work. And so all of that has been a collaborative project. And so I think that the idea is that we support each other, and these psychedelic societies are places where there's some kind of supportive structure that meets somewhat regularly, and that can be a community network that's local and real and in person, and hopefully growing. I think that's the real takeaway here to me, is just that that we're creating ways to tell our own stories, hopefully to be inspirational to others who are not telling those stories yet. So I think, briefly before we were talking a little bit about some of the things that are going on in the psychedelic community that mirror the larger culture right now. I'm a fairly educated white man. I have a certain amount of privilege to be able to speak freely and openly about these topics. And, I'm inspired by Nishay Devano, but also T-Ferry had put together a coming out video way back in 2009. And one of the arguments that she had made was that, if you have the privilege and the position to be able to speak freely about this, and it's not going to implode your life, you're not going to lose your license, that you really should really take it seriously about what it might mean for other people if you are open about your use, or gaining some benefit, especially if you were gaining some benefit from psychedelics, be it microdosing to museum dosing to mega dosing, whatever we're talking about here. The space that can be made where a number of other folks, even folks who are positioned well, that caregivers and teachers and government workers and even police officers or lawyers and federal agents or something. These people who by nature of their employment or their positionality fear talking about these things for very good reasons. Then things become easier, just because culture is about how we feel about things and what we consider to be normal. So we've now had 2 presidents who've admitted to using cocaine, I believe, and 3 who were pretty sure smoked cannabis, whether or not they inhaled. And it didn't tank their careers. And it's because the conversations and the discourses in culture around those provide enough cover that even those for whom you would expect to lose the most are able to, participate in the conversation at some level. So I think that's one of the major things that psychedelic societies do. But the other thing is I think that, things are moving very fast right now. So the whole MDMA PTSD thing, that's going to be passed at the federal level. Now, that's going to be passed at the federal level, which is a very good thing. 2020, 2021. So that really means that, in Alaska, in Arkansas, one of these MAPS trained therapists could open up in a strip mall, a nice little, office someplace, and somebody could come in talking about their PTSD from childhood, from an abusive spouse, from their local church. And through the process of processing that trauma, those people may start changing their relationships, changing their lifestyles, and somebody may get mad because, well, anytime there's change, people get mad. So I've talked to Rick Doblin about this. I've talked to a lot of people about this, and that's about, planning for a backlash. If we look at who is in the White House right now, I think most of us don't need to think too hard about how dangerous a backlash can be. And they don't call them culture wars for nothing. People are fighting for their ways of life, their privilege, the things that they take for granted. And if we start introducing, and we are introducing these catalytic compounds, we're going to see reorganizations of people's personal lives. And the best way to handle something like that is to get out in front of it. With cannabis, we know from research that people were more likely to support medicalization efforts when they knew somebody in their own life who had benefited medically from cannabis. And I think that psychedelic societies can provide a service similar to that by providing an entry point for community members, anybody who is interested about what all of these, miscreants have been up to for all this time.
That's awesome. Miscreants. Yep. So let's talk a little bit more about your work in evolutionary plant biology, or what's the title?
Yeah. Evolutionary ecology. I spent some time thinking about mushrooms as well. So, I think I'm comfortable just calling myself an evolutionary biologist or an evolutionary ecologist. But so what do you want to know?
Okay, so first off, the number one thing that comes to mind is how would a fungus start to evolve out something like psilocybin? Sounds like something you might have thought about.
That's funny because I did spend a little bit of time interviewing an OSU faculty member, Dr. Jason Slott, who has done work on that very topic. So I would encourage folks to look into his work. I think some of it's been published in the Atlantic. But according to his work, there's basically a line of evolution from breaking down wood into breaking down dung. And then from there, we see the emergence of psilocybin as a plant secondary defense compound. And I don't want to talk too much about that because I spoke to him a little while ago. And I think that it'd be great if he were on Psychedelics today at some point. But I do think a lot about plant secondary compounds. A whole chapter of my PhD is focused on antioxidants in maize. So I thought a lot about crops in my time here at OSU. So I did a master's thinking about wild, hybrid, and the diversity found in sunflower. We put together a view course on cannabis that was much more 55,000 foot view. What are all of the possible industrial uses of this? What work needs to be done to bring this crop into the 21st century? And then I've spent the majority of my PhD looking at maize land races, which would be sort of traditional varieties of maize. And so I came out here to work with Dr. Kristen Mercer. My undergraduate work had looked at differences between genetically modified organisms, in particular maize that produces an insecticide called BT, and any potential effects that it may have had on the soil rhizosphere. And that there's symbiotic organisms, symbiotic fungi and symbiotic bacteria, but my work looked at symbiotic fungi that is making associations at the root level of 90% of terrestrial plants. So, some of these things are, if you think about Avatar, for instance, like Avatar took a lot of took a lot from nature to build its world. They had this sort of neural network under the cells that was attached to the soul tree, and these people could jack into it. And I happen to know that they were taking advice from a botanist who, when they first rendered their forests, she said, "This is a tropical rainforest. Why do you have conifers in here?" But the whole mycorrhizal network has been called, by Paul Stamets, for instance, the Earth's natural internet. And he's not wrong. There's quite a bit of information that's being transmitted through these networks about the health of trees and such. And so they're also there in agricultural systems. So I came out for a couple of reasons. One, I have an interest in international travel, and so Dr. Mercer was working in southern Mexico on issues that I think were sufficiently large that I could plug in there, and that was where she had drawn a big circle around issues related to, basically communities down in Mexico. Traditional communities are very attached to maize. It's part of their cultural identity. And many of these groups are upset about Monsanto, and they don't want transgenics for better or for worse. And so a lot of the work out of the Mercer Lab was, looking at this issue. So I came down from Portland to do a PhD, and a lot of my work has been investigating mechanisms of local adaptation. So everything is adapted to some locale, and that's a match of its genotype and its phenotype to the various stresses that it faces in life. And so we did some manipulative studies where we used elevation and what we call reciprocal transplant gardens, where you take seed that is usually grown in one place and you grow it in another, and you take the seed from that place and you grow it in another. So everybody is grown everywhere. And using that, we can make comparisons that tell us things about local adaptation, about something called phenotypic plasticity, which is when one genotype has the ability to manifest multiple phenotypes depending on environmental interaction. So, a lot of what I've spent my time thinking about goes into this old debate about nature and nurture, except that we call it genes by environment. And so by investigating the mechanisms that underlie local adaptation, I've used a lot of methods that are looking at physiology and the metabolism of plants, and then secondary plant compounds. And so everything from cannabinoids to alkaloids, all of these different compounds that plants use, they often mediate relationships between organisms, whether they're microorganisms or butterflies. There are various attractants that plants use to get themselves pollinated, or repellents to prevent themselves from being chewed upon. And it turns out that the broad class of chemicals that psychedelics fall into are compounds that specifically interact with the mammalian nervous system in one way or another. And they also interact with other nervous systems. And I hasten to add all these things because I'm an ecologist, and an ecological perspective is one that topples this sort of hierarchical picture, or this central picture of humans as being the star of the show. Dennis McKenna's fond of saying plants are the ones running the show. We're just some stupid monkeys running around on them. Like something like 90% of the biomass on planet Earth is plants. Like, we could all disappear and they'd be fine. I think a lot about those things, and basically climate change is a big force. We do work in crop centers of origin. So the crop center of origin for sunflower had me out in the American Midwest. And then crop centers of origin for maize brought me down to southern Mexico. And then we do work with chili pepper as well, which is taking me to various Mexican states. And so all of this basically is acknowledging that A, crop centers of origin are repositories of genetic diversity, and B, that climate change is a big force. And so finding out how those how's the bank doing, is wise. But it's also a good laboratory to see how these genes and phenotypes and variants might be useful. One of the things that just came out, I think, of UC Davis, and it's something that I've observed in the field myself, is that, corn in Mexico is pretty different, but some of the stuff in Chiapas, it can be like 15 feet tall. Wow. Really huge. And so these variants, they're slower growing, they're lower yielding, but a lot of times they have, stress traits that are really impressive. They're able to deal with rocky soil or drought in such a way that makes them able to grow where hybrid corn, all of Monsanto's best, just can't grow quite as good. And believe me, these farmers are not Luddites. If it worked, they would use it. So they're using what works. And one of these traits that I had observed, and I'm sort of kicking myself because I wish I'd have gone a different direction with it. They have these little adventitious, like aerial type roots, if you can imagine. I'm sure most people aren't spending as much time as I have about
corn. Like mangrove structure, like above the soil.
Yeah, so they float above the soil, and you might imagine, that's maybe if they fall over, they can reroot and then reroute or something. But they were exuding a mucilage. And it was like this clear, substance that would drip down onto the soil. And, I was really interested in them. I took a bunch of photos of them. And I think I had read somebody theorizing somewhere that they had, that they were producing, food for microbes. And so the work out of UC Davis has now shown that there is this symbiosis that is initiated by the plant. And by dripping this mucilage right around the root zone, they're inviting nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which is super fantastic. That one trait that was found in the diversity of the most boring crop in the world in a lot of people's minds, corn, could potentially, if integrated into modern breeding, could reduce our reliance on nitrogen fertilizers, which are causing algal blooms and such. So I'm somebody who thinks that ecology, that nature is a great teacher. I think that we should be doing things that are based on principles of biomimicry. You and I have talked a little bit about permaculture and how there's an ethos there that looks to nature to solve problems. And I'm definitely somebody who thinks that we should be doing that, because we have very big problems that climate change represents an existential threat to civilization. That's kind of a broad way of talking about some of the things that I've been doing. But my interests, I think one of the things that I feel I need to account for is how I got from this kind of work into psychedelics. And
well, it's super trippy just hearing you talk about it. It's like like plant biology is super wild. Any biology is really wild when you start getting into the thick of it.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say, like, one, it's personal. Like, if I'm honest, some of my earliest experiences with psychedelics were the spark of curiosity about, like, why is my body and my perception able to do and perceive that? But two, climate change is such a big force, and maybe we're doing cap and trade, maybe we're we're working on carbon markets or the Paris Agreement. There's all sorts of different ways that we're doing societal. We're trying to address this issue, and we're not doing it very well. We haven't been able to. We haven't even been able to stay behind our own models for the worst case scenario for what's likely to happen with climate change. And so that's scary. For anybody who wants children or anything like that, it's a problem. And so I'm looking for something, quote, we'll probably have to cut this out. Here we go. So with regard to climate change, it's such a big force, and we've been so consistently bad at addressing it. And it comes down to a lot of things about consumption. You have people out in China and in India who would like a first world kind of lifestyle. They would like to eat meat and have cars and all that. And, that seems arbitrary. I mean, having cars is a choice that is made, as a society. I grew up in Portland. There's one of the best mass transit systems in the world there. And I think that grappling with the existential threat of climate change, it reminds me of this quote by a guy named Gus Speth. And Gus Speth was the former dean of forestry and environmental studies at Yale. He was one of the co-founders of the National Resource Defense Council. And he said, I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. So, I guess I may be painting myself as sort of an as a 60s radical by talking about this in this way, in this light. But I think about psychedelics as being so profoundly transformational to our perception of the world. The work of Catherine McLean showed that a single dose of high-dose psilocybin will permanently alter a person's personality to cause them to rate higher on a personality trait called openness. And other work has recently showed that people with psychedelic experience in their personal histories are much more likely to hold environmental views. I think that indigenous cultures are some of the most durable cultures on the planet. They've been around since people have been around, whereas industrial culture has brought us to the brink of Armageddon, not by one, but by several potential swords of Damocles falling upon our societies in 250 years, depending on how you want to count it. So I think when the stakes are that high, radically altering one's perspective is a totally rational thing to do.
I can appreciate that. Yeah. Apparently data doesn't matter, but if we can figure out how to address selfishness, greed, and apathy, I think there's a lot that can happen there. The fact that so many people are apathetic is really kind of disheartening. The greed and selfishness to me seems like secondary to the apathy in a lot of ways. If we just buckle down and do it, we're going to get there, but it's just that next shift.
Yeah, I've been reading, so I've been really interested in David Graeber's work recently. So I've been going through his canon. I read Bullshit Jobs a little while ago, and one of the things that he said, I'm in the middle of Debt, 5,000 year history. And one of the things he says in Bullshit Jobs is that, that people are just sort of being kept busy. That John was the Keynes, is it John Maynard Keynes?
Keynesian economics.
Keynesian economics. He's one of the most influential economists in the world, really. And he was predicting that by the end of the 20th century, that productivity would have increased so much that we would be able to provide for all the basics and even the luxuries of life, such that the average working person could reduce their working hours to something like 20 to 15 hours a week. And Graeber, among other points that he makes in Bullshit Jobs, says that Keynes was right and that productivity has increased that much, but that there was, for other political reasons, a need to sort of keep people busy anyway. And when I think about protest, and protest does get the goods, direct action will pressure politicians who are pretty complacent. They're happy to answer phone calls from their donors and never show up to a town hall meeting ever. So there's a lot of protest that is putting a lot of local and national and state politicians in hot water on a regular basis on a variety of topics. Imagine how things might turn out if people had an extra 10 hours a week to play with. We might start addressing some of the vast inequalities that are present. We might start asking why it is that a small group of people are allowed to profit at the cost of, the existential threat to our grandchildren and children. We might fundamentally start reevaluating, the quality of the relationships that we have in our daily life. And so, I don't know, David Graeber is an anthropologist, and he asks questions about what it means to be human. And I think one of the things that the modern world has done, and a number of more eloquent people than I have talked about it, is that it's been an alienating thing. People are looking for community, and I think being a community organizer of any sort is filling a need in society. And I grew up secular. One of the things that I am aware that churches and temples and religious communities do very well is provide meaningful community. And given that psychedelics, have reliably induced mystical and or religious experiences in people throughout time and across a lot of contexts, it just seems natural that we should start organizing communities that help unpack and contextualize these experiences. Providing tools, providing resources, peer support, mutual aid.
Yeah, I've never actually felt so good than I do after getting to discuss this stuff for an hour plus at a go with some really close people or new folks, new friends that you meet when you're organizing events. So that's a really cool way to bring it full circle there.
Yeah.
And yeah, the 10 hours extra a week thing, amen. Like, imagine how much more healthy and happy children would end up if they had 10 more hours with their parents a week or something.
From a climate change perspective, we could do nothing. We could make no new technology. We could make no new, international accords if we cut working hours by 5, 10, 20 hours a week. And that alone would massively drop the carbon output of any nation that adopted a policy like that. And, that's an easy solution. And you have to ask why. What are the factors that are preventing that? Why do we have to work 55 hours a week to barely be able to earn a 2-bedroom apartment in most places in the United States? It's
a valid question. And in some parts of the world, people are still barely making it, and they're working. Like, if you look at Hong Kong, how much people are working in Hong Kong, it's nuts. And the housing situation there is outrageous. So yeah, what do we have to do? Is it a minimum income? I don't know. Like, what do they call that? The thing they're experimenting with in the Scandinavians, and I think a little bit here.
Guaranteed minimum income.
Thank you. Yeah. So just kind of like you're definitely going to get this. And if you have something fucked up happen, you have a little bit of a balance, and you can skate by, and takes the stress off quite a bit. What happens when we're less stressed? What does that culture look like?
Good thing.
Burning Man in New York City. I'm game.
You mentioned Burning Man, and I think it just happened. And a lot of people are getting back, and they're in the afterglow. And I love Burning Man. I was there last year and got married with my beautiful wife. But Burning Man is not something that the majority of any group of people are ever going to experience. It's definitely an elite affair. It costs at least $1,500 just to get your butt out there, depending on where you're coming from. And I think that's a source of resentment. And I think it's one of the things that people who are in the psychedelic community should be just aware that not everybody relates to the kinds of debauchery and hedonism that goes on at transformational art festivals, and that if we are going to be anything other than insular communities, I think a friend referred to another group as people who like the smell of our own farts a lot. The psychedelic community needs to become more inclusive in a material and credible way. And, I never really thought that being a grassroots organizer would be, my fate, but I can't think of something where there's more work to be done than in the psychedelic world. I'm sure that there's other places, but I'm biased, obviously. But maybe folks who are working on gender, for instance, there's just a tremendous amount of unpacking and unlearning and relearning that needs to be done before people can even begin to grasp what we're talking about with psychedelics. Because I happen to think that people have been using psychedelics as a part of their social structures for longer than they have not, if we're talking about evolutionary history. When we look at the Inquisition came and they dealt with a lot of midwifery and other kinds of, witchcraft, which was really like traditional healing with plants. And we know that there was even, medieval use of, or at least knowledge of various psychoactive fungi, and not just the Ammonitis. So when the church came to along with Christopher Columbus, and they came to the Americas, our first knowledge of mushrooms, of Teon and Noctal, came from a codex that was written in the 16th century. And then it wasn't rediscovered again until Maria Sabina and Gordon Wasson had their meeting in 1953. So the church was incredibly effective at suppressing traditional plant medicine, and I would say it's probably because there was an existential threat to the church posed by direct access to spiritual realms, and B, that it just shows that how fragile things can be. Violence is a force that can get a lot done, and usually the aftermath isn't a nice place.
Right. Yeah, I can definitely appreciate that. So we're at a bit over an hour here. So I'm curious if there's anything you want to throw in before we kind of close up.
Yeah. So let me think here. We talked a little bit about our partners. I might address the Timothy Leary thing here real quick. Find the Others is a project that takes its name from a quote that's been in use for a long time in the psychedelic world. If you go on Twitter right now, you'll find that there are a number of hashtag Find the Others kinds of things out there. But the quote was from Timothy Leary, and he says, "Who knows what you might learn from taking a chance on a conversation with a stranger? Everyone carries a piece of the puzzle. Nobody comes into your life by mere coincidence. Trust your instincts, do the unexpected, find the others." Now, I just want to talk a little bit for a moment about Timothy Leary, because I think that his legacy is controversial enough that it's already come up in the discussion of this project. He was somebody with a messiah complex, and he very, very definitely damaged the ability for Middle America to embrace psychedelics in any kind of orderly fashion. It was incredibly confrontational. But he also helped distill the concept of set and setting, which is something that is useful. And I say distill because the rituals that are in place in indigenous communities are very, very well aware of the importance of set and setting. But many people don't know that he saw the inside of 36 prisons, and that he was put there for a couple of joints of cannabis, and facing just ridiculous lengths of prison time. He successfully argued against the Marijuana Tax Act on constitutional grounds, which is incredibly impressive. But he was basically a guy with a media strategy that that was about Timothy Leary, and so a lot of people do this sort of somewhat paradoxical thing where they say that he single-handedly caused LSD to be outlawed, but at the same time they want to say that he took too much credit for things. I don't believe that Timothy Leary alone caused these things to be scheduled. I think that was going to happen one way or another. And one of the things that Michael Pollan says in his book is that at the end of the day, Timothy Leary's main crime was that he said publicly what anybody who had experience with LSD knew and believed privately. And so, that I think that is one reason why I chose the quote, but also because it's one of those things where it's just an organizing thing. The quote itself is something that I think acknowledges the need to reach out to people who aren't like yourself. Douglas Rushkoff talked about how the greatest thing about finding the others is that when you do, they're no longer others. And so I think the theme here is connection and finding each other. But that said, Timothy Leary is definitely somebody who was controversial in his time, and so because we're now far beyond all of that, and we're going into a newer future, that there are going to be quotes on the main page that cycle through. So quotes from other people in the space, quotes from women and people like Douglas Rushkoff, for instance. But T. Ferry has a quote that I like. Because she was influential to me with regard to coming out of the closet. She said something about how many people would if just like 25% of folks would share their experiences with psychedelics, what would that change? So let's see. Actually, sorry, I'm screwing it up. Okay, so T. Ferry said, if even 5% of the people who use psychedelics would admit it, the entire landscape of the debate would be radically altered. So I don't know. I mean, even Jimi Hendrix, he says, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. I think the idea is to share multiple quotes from multiple people in a way that I think is consistent with the Find the Others structure, which is allowing people to speak in their own words about what it is that they're doing. And so I think one thing that I would really like to say is to any of the folks out there who are organizers of psychedelic societies who saw this request for videos come out and wanted to see how this whole project would shake out. I think that it's really great to tell people what it is that you're doing in a video format. I mean, I think the idea here is a little bit of organizational development is what comes out of making a video that explains what you're doing. I find that as an organizer of a society, I'm usually talking about and making a case for with my own community, what are we going to be doing next? Who's coming up? Who are they? Why are they important? Why should you show up? And very little time is spent on just arguing on behalf of the organization itself. What are we doing with Mind Manifest Midwest? What kinds of events do we have? And so for all the organizers out there, definitely submit a video. It will go and link to all of your contact information. And when all of this is shared, when people see this on Twitter or something, hopefully they can get in contact with your group, and you can meet some new friends and reach out to folks that you hadn't met before. So just a appeal. So those of you who are organizing communities, I know it's rough to take time away from your next event or your day job, but putting together a 2-minute video that explains what it is that you're doing with your organization, we can make sure that people will see it on findtheothersproject.org. So thanks.
Well, thank you, Brian, for all the hard work you're doing. I want to say so much to defend Tim Leary, but I'll save that for another episode. And blame Nixon. Hashtag blame Nixon.
I do agree.
So I am even closer and closer to starting my own club here. I can't wait. Just hung out with the people down at the Denver Psychedelic Club, and that was fun on Monday night. And yeah, man, I appreciate all your work, and it's really, I think, going to pay huge dividends to all of us. So keep it going, and thanks for all that effort, man. I think we all really don't even understand how much we appreciate it yet. So
well, I just think that if the societies can't find ways to support each other and work together and learn from each other, what are we doing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Share resources. And I think we're just on the edge of something really amazing, and I'm psyched. All right. Well, findtheothers.org.
Yep. Findtheothersproject.org.
Findtheothersproject.org. Check it out, everybody. And, okay, cool. Until next time, Brian, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
And there you have it. Please let us know what you think. You can hit us up, Psychedelics Today, email at gmail.com. And we'd just really love to hear from you. You can also hit us up on Twitter, Psychedelics Today, Facebook, Instagram. I think that's about it. I think we've been uploading our stuff on YouTube. If you want to share a little bit easier, you can kind of just go over there, just search Psychedelics Today. You'll definitely find us. And it's easier to post those onto Facebook and other socials than certain other things. So maybe people dig it. So thanks for tuning in again. If you want to support us, please do leave us a review on iTunes. It really does make a difference. And keep in mind that you only have about a day left from when this podcast is released on the 2nd of October to enroll for the class. The live version of Navigating Psychedelics with extra support from Kyle and I, secret Facebook groups to communicate in, and we think you are going to dig it. So check it out, psychedelicstoday, shop.com, psychedelicstoday.com. Thank you all. This is Joe Moore.